Hey listeners, this is Peter and welcome back to the History Shorts. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the world. Download Podcast Republic today, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. The next time you pick up a can of beer, look at the label. Ingredients, alcohol content, government warning, production standards. Behind every one of those requirements is a regulatory apparatus. Federal agencies, international standards bodies, inspection regimes, quality control protocols. That governs how every consumable product on Earth is made, stored, and distributed. Now let's consider this. The foundational logic of that entire system I just named, the idea that the production of food and drink must be governed by written rules, enforced by institutional authority, and monitored through systematic inspection, well, that was not invented by a government agency. It was actually invented by monks. In medieval European monasteries, between roughly the 6th and 15th centuries, the brewing of beer was governed by a set of regulations so precise, so comprehensive, and so insistent on cleanliness and process control that they constitute, in any honest historical accounting, the earliest documented system of food production standards in Western civilization. Our history brief today returns to the History Shorts conversation series vault in a chat with the New York Times best-selling author William Dalrymple. A quick word from our sponsors. This day in history. On May 20th, 1873, Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis received a patent for blue jeans, creating a durable style of clothing that would become a global symbol of American culture. On May 20th, 1927, aviator Charles Lindbergh took off on the first solo nonstop transatlantic flight, departing from New York toward Paris in the spirit of St. Louis. Story of the day. The story today begins with a document that has nothing directly to do with beer. In 516 AD, an Italian monk named Benedict of Nursia wrote a set of rules for the governance of monastic communities. The Rule of Saint Benedict, or the Regula Benedicti, became the foundational document of Western monasterism, adopted by communities across Europe over the following centuries as the definite guide to how a monastery should be organized and what its members should do with their time, and how the community should sustain itself. The rule was specific about labor. Monks were to work with their hands. They were to produce, not merely consume. And in the climate of Northern Europe, where grain was abundant, water was often unsafe to drink, and a community of dozens of hundreds of people required reliable daily caloric intake, brewing beer was not a luxury. It was actually a necessity. A monastery that could not produce stable, nutritious, reliably safe beer could not sustain its community through a Northern European winter. The brewing of beer was, therefore, not incidental to monastic life. It was actually central to it. And what the monastery tradition brought to brewing, what distinguished monasteries' beer from the ale produced in medieval village households, was documentation. The monks wrote everything down. This was, in itself, a revolutionary act in a largely illiterate medieval world. Monastery brewing manuals, some surviving in manuscript form in European archives to this very day, specified not merely what ingredients to use and in what proportions, but also how the brewing vessels were to be cleaned before use, and how the water was to be sourced and treated, how the fermentation environment was to be maintained, and how the finished product was to be tested for quality before distribution. The Cistercian order, which expanded dramatically across Europe from the 12th century onward, was particularly systematic. Cistercian monasteries maintained detailed brewing records, tracking ingredient sources, fermentation temperatures, batch yields, and spoilage incidents with a precision that would not look out of place in a modern quality control log. The reasoning behind this precision was not purely practical, it was theological. The rule of Saint Benedict specified that the abbot was responsible for everything produced within the monastery walls. A spoiled batch of beer was not merely a waste of resources, it was a failure of a community's stewardship, a violation of the obligation to use God's gifts responsibly. Cleanliness in the brewery was, in this framework, a spiritual obligation as much as a practical one. The monk who failed to scrub the fermentation vessel was not merely inefficient, he was negligent before God. That theological framing gave monastic brewing regulations a force that purely economic incentives just could not have produced. The specific sanitation practices documented in monastic brewing records are, for a modern microbiological perspective, remarkably effective. The monks did not know about microorganisms. They had no concept of bacteria, yeast, or the biological process of fermentation. What they knew, accumulated over centuries of empirical observation, was that certain practices produced good beer, and that certain practices produced spoiled beer. Vessels that were not thoroughly cleaned between batches produced beer that made people sick. Water from certain sources produced better beer than water from others. Fermentation conducted at consistent temperatures produced more reliable results than fermentation in fluctuating conditions. Each of these observations maps, with striking precision, onto what modern food science understands about contamination prevention, water quality, and temperature control in fermentation. The monks had arrived, through centuries of careful practice and rigorous documentation, at the correct conclusions, without any of the theoretical framework that would eventually explain why those very conclusions were correct. The most direct institutional connection between monastic brewing standards and modern food safety regulation runs through the German the Reinheitsgebot, the Bavarian beer purity law, specified that beer could be brewed only from water, barley, and hops. It is often presented as the world's first food safety law. That framing is too narrow, however. The Bavarian beer purity law was a secular codification of principles that monastic brewers had been practicing for centuries. Its authors, the Bavarian Duke Wilhelm IV and his brother Ludwig X, were not inventing a new standard. They were taking an existing one, developed and refined in the monasteries of medieval Europe, and simply given it the force of civil law. The chain of transmission runs clearly. Monastic brewing regulations establish the principle that production standards must be written, enforced, and monitored. The Bavarian beer purity law gave that principle civic authority. Later, national food safety legislation, such as Britain's Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, the United States Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, and eventually the International Codex Alimentarius standards adopted in the 1960s, extended that authority to every consumable product on Earth. The logic is the same at every step. What you eat and drink must be produced according to documented standards, enforced by institutional authority, and monitored through systematic inspection. And that logic was not born in a government building. It was born in a monastery. The History Brief. The following excerpt comes from a past History Shorts Conversation series episode and a chat with the New York Times best-selling author William Dalrymple. Search for the entire interview wherever you're listening to this show. And don't forget, you can now watch entire video interviews on our YouTube channel. Just look for History Shorts Podcast.
India was conquered by a multinational corporation like, Meta or Facebook, called the East India Company, that was subcontracted by the British government to run its affairs with not just India, but the whole of the East, anything east of Cape of Good Hope. And this bizarre story whereby a corporation run for profit by shareholders end up controlling what was then the richest country in the world. India controlled, during the Mughal Empire in the kind of 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, a quarter of the world's production. But through most of history, India and China have been the world's two richest lands. And the reason the British and the French and the Portuguese and the Dutch all went to India was because it was so incredibly rich.
Thank you so much for spending some time with me today and helping to make this little show such a mighty success. If you are enjoying this show and would like to help with its production, you can always donate a few dollars at buymeacoffee.com or become a Patreon member to enjoy these episodes ad-free. Both of those links can be found on our website at www.historyshortspodcast.com. And don't forget to check out our YouTube channel, where we have different series that are not part of this main feed. Have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you all again tomorrow.
In 2020, two best friends and history teachers dropped a podcast, and people actually listened. Fans showed up. Then 2024 hit, COVID ended, and life said nah. Well, History Teachers Talking is back. Bigger, louder, and still wildly unqualified to talk about, well, everything that is remotely history adjacent. History Teachers Talking is now streaming wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the History Shorts Network.